imagine a place where sheep outnumber people, where young women have been quietly leaving for decades, not out of despair, but out of ambition, where thousands of people drive to work every single morning through tunnels bored beneath the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, where the weather changes so fast that locals don't bother checking the forecast. Because by the time the forecast is right, the moment has already passed. That place exists, and it isn't a fantasy novel. It's a real living, breathing archipelago sitting in the cold grey heart of the North Atlantic, equidistant between Iceland, Norway, and Scotland, a cluster of islands that most people couldn't find on a map without help, and yet once seen can never be forgotten. Welcome to the Faroe Islands. At first glance, the name barely registers, the Faroe Islands. You might picture something bleak and forgettable, a rock in the sea, a fishing port, maybe a lighthouse. But the reality is something else entirely. The Faroe Islands are one of the most visually extraordinary places on the surface of this earth. Towering green cliffs rising more than 2,300 feet straight out of the sea. Waterfalls that pour off the edge of the world directly into the Atlantic. Villages of a dozen people perched on ledges where no village should logically survive. Grass-roofed houses that look like they belong in a fairy tale, but are simply the local way of building. Tunnels that spiral beneath the ocean floor and emerge on the other side of an island like portals into another dimension. And above it all, an infinite, rolling, shape-shifting sky that goes from piercing blue to silver fog to driving rain and back to sunshine, sometimes all before lunch. The Faroe Islands are not a country, exactly. They occupy a peculiar political space, an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, but with their own language, their own flag, their own parliament, their own cultural identity, and their own fierce, deeply felt sense of who they are. They are Faroese. Not Danish, not Scandinavian in any blended generic sense. Faroese. The distinction matters enormously to the people who live there, and it should matter to anyone trying to understand this place. The archipelago consists of 18 volcanic islands spanning roughly 540 square miles. To put that in perspective, the entire landmass is slightly smaller than Los Angeles, and yet it houses an extraordinary diversity of landscape. Deep fjords, sheer sea cliffs, glacial valleys, hidden lakes, coastal moorlands, and an ever-present ocean that wraps around every edge. No point on any of the islands is more than 3 miles from the sea. The ocean isn't just nearby, it's everywhere. It defines the air, the food, the economy, the identity, and the soul of the place. The population sits at just over 50,000 people. That's smaller than many mid-sized American towns. But in terms of personality, culture, and sheer visual drama, the Faroe Islands punch far above their weight. There is no wasted space here. No suburban sprawl, no concrete sprawl, no miles of sameness. Every acre of the landscape is alive with something. And then there are the sheep. More than 70,000 of them roam freely across the islands. Roughly 1.4 sheep for every human being. They wander into roads, they graze on cliff tops, they appear at impossible angles on impossible slopes, and they've been here in one form or another for over 1,000 years. The very name of the islands, Faroe, comes from the Old Norse word ferija, which means simply and perfectly sheep islands. Standing on the edge of one of those cliff tops, with the wind pressing hard against your chest, the sea crashing hundreds of feet below, and a sheep looking at you with total indifference, you realize that this place operates by its own rules. It always has. Every society has its fault lines. The Faroe Islands' most visible fault line is demographic, and it has been quietly reshaping the culture for generations. Walk into any school in the Faroe Islands, and you'll notice something. The boys and girls are roughly equal in number. Walk into the same school 10 or 15 years later, and the picture has shifted. Many of the young women are gone. The phenomenon is well documented and widely discussed within Faroese society. Young women, at higher rates than young men, leave the islands after secondary school. They go to Denmark, Norway, the UK, and other European countries to study, to build careers, to explore lives that simply aren't available at home in sufficient variety or scale. The Faroe Islands have one university, a small institution with limited fields of study. A young woman who wants to study medicine, law, architecture, film, or psychology has almost no choice but to leave. This isn't a tragedy of hopelessness, it's a story of ambition meeting limitation. The Faroe Islands are prosperous by global standards, safe, clean, and deeply community-oriented. But they are also small, and smallness imposes constraints. When the total population of an entire nation is the size of a mid-sized American city, the range of professional and educational opportunities available locally is, by necessity, narrow. The result is a measurable gender imbalance. There are significantly more men than women in the Faroe Islands, particularly in the younger adult age brackets. And this imbalance has produced some remarkable and unexpected social dynamics. In a nation this small, losing even a few hundred young women has a visible, felt effect. Communities notice. Families notice. The demographic data is not abstract, it's personal. Your sister left. Your classmates left. Your neighbour's daughters left. And so Faroese men have increasingly looked beyond the islands for partners. Over the past few decades, marriages between Faroese men and women from the Philippines and Thailand have become common. Not unusual, not exotic, but simply a recognised part of the social fabric. Hundreds of Southeast Asian women now call the Faroe Islands home, and their presence has woven new threads into a culture that was previously one of the most ethnically homogenous in the world. The adjustment for these women is monumental. Imagine leaving a country where the temperature rarely dips below 70 degrees Fahrenheit, where the air is thick and humid, where cities are vibrant and noisy, and teeming with people, and arriving in a place where fierce Atlantic winds can rattle your windows all night, where the temperature in February hovers just above freezing, where the nearest city with a significant population is a plane ride away, and where the entire population of your new home country is smaller than the neighbourhood you grew up in. It requires extraordinary resilience, and yet, from all accounts, many of these women have built genuine and meaningful lives in the Faroe Islands. They have integrated into communities, learned the language, raised children, and contributed to a culture that was once thought to be closed. Their presence is a quiet testament to the human capacity for adaptation, and to the Faroese willingness, however gradual, to evolve. The women who stay are a different kind of remarkable. Those who choose to remain in the Faroe Islands, or who return after studying abroad, often do so with clear eyes. They know what they're choosing. They're choosing a place where everybody knows your name, and most of your business too. Where the winters are long and dark. Where the job market is narrow. Where you might see the same 50 people every day for the rest of your life. And they choose it anyway because the community is real, the landscape is unlike anything else on earth, and the sense of belonging to something specific and small and genuinely yours is something that no city, however glittering, can quite replicate. Let's be honest about something. In the Faroe Islands, sheep are not livestock. They are residents. They have territorial rights. They have opinions about traffic. And they have been here far longer than the roads that occasionally inconvenience them. With over 70,000 sheep roaming across 18 islands where only 50,000 humans live, the math makes one thing clear. If the sheep ever organised, they'd win the election. They certainly seem to be winning the argument about right-of-way. Unlike sheep in New Zealand, Australia, or the American West, Faroese sheep are not confined to fenced pastures. They roam freely, across mountains, through valleys, along sea cliffs, into villages, and directly onto roads, where they will stop, stare at your car with magnificent indifference, and take however long they require before deciding to move. Locals don't honk. Visitors quickly learn not to either. There is an unspoken social contract. The sheep were here first, and they will be here long after any individual car is gone. This is not entirely metaphor. The sheep have been here for over 1,000 years. They were brought to the islands by Viking settlers somewhere around the 9th or 10th century, and they formed the backbone of the Faroese economy and diet for centuries. They provided food, wool for clothing, trade goods, and the fat that kept lamps burning through long northern winters. In return, the islands provided them with some of the most lush and unenclosed grazing land in the North Atlantic. The relationship between the Faroese people and their sheep is intimate in a way that is difficult to explain to outsiders. The sheep are not pets. They are also not simply commodities. They are part of the landscape in a way that feels almost geological, like the cliffs and the fjords and the constant wind. The sheep are simply part of what the Faroe Islands are. Every year, in a tradition that has continued for over a millennium, villagers hold a Celtidin. a collective sheep gathering in which the entire community participates. Sheep are herded down from mountain pastures, sorted by their owner's mark on their ears, and the lambs are separated from the adults. It's practical, yes, but it's also communal, social, and deeply tied to a sense of shared identity. The sheep gathering is one of the oldest surviving collective traditions in the North Atlantic. The name tells you everything. Faroe, Sheep Islands. They aren't called that ironically. They're called that because the sheep, from the very beginning, were the reason people survived here. And in some essential cultural sense, they still are. There is something that happens to first-time visitors to the Faroe Islands that is hard to predict. You expect beauty. You've seen the photographs, the dramatic landscapes, the clifftop vistas. What you don't expect is the rooftops. Across the Faroe Islands, you will find houses with roofs made of grass. Not decorative grass, not landscaping. Actual, living, growing turf, thick layers of earth packed over a wooden frame, from which green grass grows and in spring, wildflowers bloom. Some roofs are so perfectly integrated with the surrounding landscape that, from a distance, the houses seem to disappear into the hillside entirely. From certain angles, you might be looking directly at a house and not know it. This isn't an affectation or a tourist attraction, although it has certainly become one. Turf roofing is one of the oldest building technologies in the North Atlantic, brought to the Faroe Islands by Viking settlers over 1,000 years ago. And it wasn't chosen for aesthetic reasons. It was chosen because it works. The thick layer of earth and vegetation acts as insulation, trapping warmth inside the house during the long, cold winters and keeping the interior cool during the brief, mild summers. In a place where timber was historically scarce and imported materials prohibitively expensive, turf was abundant, local, and effective. The village of Gassadalur is perhaps the most famous example of grass-roofed architecture in the Faroe Islands. Situated on a ledge above a waterfall that cascades directly into the Atlantic. With a population of a dozen or so people, Gassadalur looks like a village from a time before photography, before most of modernity in fact. The houses crouch against the hillside, their turf roofs blending into the surrounding slopes, and the whole scene has the quality of something dreamed rather than built. But grass roofs aren't just for remote villages. In the capital, Tórshavn, the old quarter known as Tinganes, where the Faroese parliament has sat for over 1,000 years, is lined with dark wooden buildings topped with turf roofs that have stood for centuries. Even the Faroe Islands' main cultural centre, the Nordic house in Tórshavn, features a sweeping turf roof as its signature architectural element. It bridges old and new. Traditional building technology applied to a modern public building, creating something that is simultaneously ancient and contemporary. And then there are the sheep on the rooftops. In a nation where sheep outnumber people and roam where they please, it is not uncommon to look up and see a sheep standing on someone's roof, calmly eating the grass that happens to be growing there. This is not considered alarming. Nobody calls anyone. The sheep eventually decides it has had enough and moves on. Life continues. There is something profound in this image. The grass-roofed house, the sheep grazing on the roof, the sea visible in the background, the wind pushing everything sideways. That captures something essential about the Faroe Islands. This is a place where the old ways were never fully replaced by the new, where the landscape was never fully tamed, where humans and animals and weather and geography have reached a kind of negotiated equilibrium that has lasted 1,000 years and shows no sign of breaking. In New York City, there are roughly 12,000 traffic signals. London has more than 6,000. Even mid-sized European cities typically have hundreds. In the Faroe Islands, a country of over 50,000 people, with a capital city and a functioning road network connecting its 18 islands. There are just a handful of traffic lights. In some counts, fewer than 10 across the entire archipelago. This is not because the Faroe Islands are economically underdeveloped. By Nordic standards, they are quite prosperous. It's because traffic, in the conventional sense, is simply not a problem here. The roads are narrow and winding, yes, carved through mountain passes, hugging cliff edges, dipping into valleys, emerging from tunnels, but they carry relatively little traffic. The Faroe Islands are small enough, and the population spread enough, that the bottlenecks and gridlock of urban life are essentially absent. The main obstacles you'll encounter on a Faroese road are not red lights or rush hour traffic. They are sheep. A flock of sheep crossing a mountain road at their own unhurried pace is the closest thing to gridlock that most drivers here will experience. And as previously established, you do not honk at the sheep. But the Faroe Islands' relationship with roads goes far beyond their absence of traffic lights. What the islands have done with their infrastructure is nothing short of extraordinary and reveals something important about how a small, resourceful society solves problems. When you are an archipelago, a nation of multiple islands scattered across the ocean, connectivity is existential. How do people get to work? How do goods move? How do families visit one another? Traditionally, the answer was ferries, and ferries are fine as long as the weather cooperates. In the North Atlantic, the weather does not always cooperate. The Faroe Islands have spent decades building one of the most audacious infrastructure networks in the world. 23 tunnels, including 4 subsea tunnels that burrow beneath the ocean floor to connect islands that previously required a ferry crossing. In a nation with the population of a small American city, this is an almost incomprehensible investment, a testament to the Faroese commitment to connectivity and the deep understanding that isolation in a place this remote can be a killer. The most famous of these is the Tunnel, the Ice Tree Tunnel, completed in 2020. At almost 11 kilometers, roughly 7 miles long, it is one of the longest subsea road tunnels in the world. It dives to approximately 187 meters, 614 feet below sea level. At its deepest point, it does something that no tunnel in the world had done before. It contains an underwater roundabout, not a metaphorical roundabout, an actual traffic circle beneath the Atlantic Ocean. At the center of this roundabout stands a massive illuminated sculpture by Faroese artist Tróndur Patursson, a towering glowing work of light and color that has been compared to a jellyfish, to the Northern Lights, to something from science fiction. Some drivers coming through the tunnel for the first time are so stunned by the sight that they drive around the roundabout multiple times simply to look at it again. And if you tune your car radio to FM 97 while you're down there, you can hear a specially composed soundtrack made from the ambient sounds of the tunnel itself. The hum of ventilation, the rush of air, the echo of tires on wet asphalt transformed into something almost musical. This is what the Faroe Islands do. They take the practical and make it poetic. They take the functional and turn it into art. They don't have the population of London or the budget of Germany, but they have something else. The imagination to do extraordinary things in small spaces, and the will to see those things through. In a place where a storm can close a ferry route for days, where thick fog rolls in without warning, where the Atlantic makes its own rules, the tunnels have changed everything. Communities that were once isolated by weather are now connected regardless of what the sky does. People who once planned their lives around ferry schedules now simply drive. The tunnels are infrastructure, yes, but they are also an act of defiance, a refusal to let geography determine destiny. Forget what you know about European cuisine. The Faroe Islands eat differently from anywhere else on the continent. And if you arrive expecting pasta, tapas, or croissants, you are going to be surprised. The traditional Faroese diet was built by necessity. In a place with a short growing season, rocky soil, and a relentlessly unpredictable climate, agriculture was always limited. What the islands had in abundance was the sea. And so the sea became the pantry. Fish, shellfish, whale, and seabird have been the foundations of Faroese cooking for 1,000 years, supplemented by lamb and, in recent centuries, dairy and root vegetables. The most distinctive element of Faroese food is not the ingredients themselves, but what is done to them. In a climate with reliable cold winds and few refrigeration options until very recently, the Faroese developed sophisticated methods of preservation that are unlike anything practiced elsewhere in Europe. Rust is the defining concept, a Faroese word that translates, roughly, as fermented or wind-dried, but captures something more specific than either English word suggests. Rust refers to the slow fermentation and drying of meat, particularly lamb, in traditional wooden sheds called jalla. These sheds are built with vertical slats that allow Atlantic wind to blow through freely, but keep rain out. Inside, cuts of lamb are hung from hooks and left to cure for months, sometimes for the better part of a year. What happens during this process is fermentation. The meat doesn't simply dry, it develops a complex biochemistry. Lactic acid bacteria work on the tissue, breaking down proteins and fats in ways that create entirely new flavor compounds. The result is rastkjøt, fermented lamb, which has a flavor profile that is unlike any other cured meat in the world. It is pungent, sharp, slightly sour, deeply savory, and unmistakably itself. For visitors, the first encounter with rastkjøt can be challenging. The smell alone is enough to make some people take a step back. But those who push through discover something extraordinary, a flavor of profound depth and complexity, the product of time, air, and cold that no other technique can replicate. Skarpakjøt goes even further. Where rastkjøt is cured for a few months, skarpakjøt is aged for a full year or more until the meat is completely desiccated, hard, chewy, intensely concentrated in flavor. Think of it as Faroese charcuterie in its most extreme form. Slice it thin, eat it with bread and butter, and you're eating something that embodies 1,000 years of survival. The sea, of course, is equally present. Faroese salmon is internationally recognized as among the finest in the world. The cold, clean, oxygen-rich waters around the islands produce fish of exceptional quality, firm, richly flavored, and free of the soft texture that can afflict farmed salmon raised in warmer waters. Many of the world's best restaurants source their Atlantic salmon from the Faroe Islands, and a significant proportion of the island's economy is built around aquaculture. Cod is equally central. Dried, salted, smoked, boiled, baked, and prepared in every possible way. It has fed Faroese families through centuries of hardship, and it remains a staple today. The Faroe Islands fishing grounds are among the most productive in the North Atlantic, and the management of these resources, a constant negotiation between economic need, environmental sustainability, and national identity, is one of the defining political conversations of contemporary Faroese life. Then there is the issue of pilot whale, grind in Faroese, which is perhaps the most internationally controversial aspect of Faroese culture. The hunting of pilot whales has been practiced in the Faroe Islands for over 1,000 years. It is not commercial hunting. The whales are not sold. They are distributed communally among participating villages. The practice is deeply embedded in Faroese history and self-understanding, tied to the survival of isolated communities through long, brutal winters when other food sources were exhausted. But the world has changed, and the controversy around Grindadrap, the pilot whale hunt, has intensified. Images of the sea turning red around beached whales, broadcast around the world by animal welfare organisations and international media, have made the practice one of the most debated cultural traditions in Europe. Critics argue that it is unnecessary in a modern, prosperous country that no longer depends on whale meat for survival. Defenders argue that it is an integral part of Faroese identity, that the whales are killed as quickly as possible, and that the right of a people to maintain their own cultural traditions should not be decided by outsiders who have never faced the isolation and scarcity that produce those traditions. There is no easy answer here. The debate reflects a genuine tension between cultural sovereignty and universal ethics that is not unique to the Faroe Islands, but is particularly acute there, given the relative size and visibility of the tradition. What is clear is that the Faroese themselves are engaged in an ongoing, serious, and sometimes heated internal conversation about the future of grind. And that conversation is for them, ultimately, to resolve. For visitors who prefer to navigate Faroese cuisine without venturing into fermented lamb or whale, there is still plenty to explore. The shellfish, langoustine, scallops, oysters are exceptional, raised in some of the coldest and cleanest waters in the world, which produces a sweetness and richness that is genuinely remarkable. The flatbread, drillur, made from oat or barley flour, is simple and satisfying, perfect with smoked fish and butter. And rhubarb, one of the few crops that grows reliably in the Faroese climate, appears in everything from cakes to jams to desserts, a tart, bright note in a cuisine that otherwise runs to deep, dark, preserved flavors. Eating in the Faroe Islands is an education in what food tastes like when it is shaped entirely by geography, when the land and sea and climate determine the menu, rather than global supply chains and consumer trends. It is not always easy food. Sometimes it is confrontational food, but it is always honest. Ask someone to describe the Faroe Islands, and they will almost certainly mention the landscape, the cliffs, the fjords, the waterfalls, the sea. What they rarely mention, unless they've been there, is what the landscape lacks. There are almost no trees. Stand on a hillside in the Faroe Islands and look in any direction. You will see grass, vivid, saturated, almost unnaturally green, the result of constant moisture and a mild oceanic climate. You will see rock, dark and dramatic. You will see sky, enormous and expressive. You will see sea, but you will see almost no trees. The tree line, in the conventional sense, doesn't exist. The islands are essentially treeless, a characteristic so striking that it takes a moment to register and then another moment to understand why. The reason is the wind. Faroe Islands sit in the path of some of the most persistent and powerful wind systems in the Atlantic. These winds are not occasional, they are structural, a defining feature of the climate. In such conditions, trees struggle to establish themselves. Saplings that manage to germinate are typically battered into the ground within a year or two. Only in the most sheltered positions, certain valleys, the lee sides of hills, protected urban spaces, do trees survive, and even there they grow stunted, twisted by the prevailing winds into shapes that speak of constant resistance. In Tórshavn and a few other towns, you will find planted trees, carefully cultivated in sheltered spots, nurtured by residents who appreciate their rarity. The Faroe Islands have actually been engaged in an ongoing afforestation project for decades, attempting to establish tree cover in places where the conditions allow. It is slow, patient work, and its results are modest but real. The absence of trees might sound like a loss. In practice, it creates something extraordinary. Without forest cover to obscure the horizon, the landscape reveals itself in its entirety. Every ridge, every valley, every cliff edge and coastline is fully visible. The scale of the terrain becomes legible in a way that is simply impossible in forested country. You can stand on one hill and see simultaneously the fjord below you, the village across the water, the island in the middle distance, and the open ocean beyond that, the entire world laid out without impediment. And then there is the secondary benefit that visitors from tropical and temperate regions discover with disbelief. There are no mosquitoes. In most parts of the world, water plus summer equals mosquitoes. The Faroe Islands have abundant water, rivers, lakes, waterfalls, constant rain, but the climate is simply too cold and the winds too consistent for mosquito populations to establish themselves. A summer evening hike along a Faroese lake involves no cloud of insects, no incessant whining, no frantic application of repellent. You can sit by the water, watch the light change across the surface, listen to the wind and the birds, and nothing will bite you. For visitors accustomed to spending outdoor time in a running battle with insects, this absence is almost disorienting. It changes the fundamental character of being outside. The outdoors in the Faroe Islands is genuinely welcoming in a way that is rare at this latitude and near this much water. The trade-off, of course, is the weather. What the islands give you in mosquito-free outdoor time, they take back in unpredictability. The Faroese have a saying that is repeated to every visitor. If you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes. This is not entirely a joke. The microclimate of the Faroe Islands is notoriously variable. The result of the island's position in the mid-Atlantic, where cold Arctic air and relatively warm Gulf Stream water interact constantly, producing weather systems that shift rapidly and without much warning. You can leave the house in sunshine, you can be caught in heavy rain before you reach your destination, you can be wrapped in thick Atlantic fog that reduces visibility to a few meters. You can be back in sunshine before your coffee gets cold. All of this can happen in a single morning. All of this has happened to visitors on countless single mornings. This is not ideal weather, but it is extraordinary weather. Alive, dramatic, constantly changing, and genuinely dramatic in the way that very few places on Earth can match. The light in the Faroe Islands, when it appears, has a quality that photographers travel thousands of miles to capture. Soft, diffuse, golden in summer, almost luminescent when the clouds break after rain. Here is a scenario. You walk into a large hall. There is no band, there are no speakers, there is no DJ, no guitar, no piano, no recorded music of any kind. And yet 200 people are dancing. Not randomly, not informally. They are locked arm in arm in a vast breathing circle that fills the room. They are moving in perfect synchrony, a slow, steady sideways step, left, 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 and a small step back. That creates a pulse as regular as a heartbeat, as ancient as the hills outside the window. And they are singing, all of them together, in a sound that begins as a murmur and rises into something that reverberates off the walls and seems to fill every cubic inch of the room. This is the Faroese chain dance, known in Faroese as Faroese dansa, and it is one of the oldest surviving folk dance traditions in Europe. Its roots reach back to the medieval period. Some scholars trace it to the 14th century, though the form almost certainly has earlier Viking antecedents. For hundreds of years, it has been the primary communal entertainment of the Faroese people. And unlike virtually every other traditional dance in Europe, it survived the centuries without being written down, recorded, or systematically preserved by institutions. It survived because the people kept doing it. Generation after generation in community halls and living rooms and outdoor festivals, the chain dance simply continued. The structure of the dance is deceptively simple. Participants link hands, right hand over the left hand of the person beside them, and form a circle. The lead singer, called the skipari, the skipper, begins a ballad. These ballads, called cuisine, can run to dozens or even hundreds of verses telling epic stories drawn from Norse mythology, medieval legend, Viking sagas, and Faroese history. The skipari sings each verse alone. The circle responds with the chorus. And throughout the singing, everyone moves in the same measured, unified step. There are no instruments. The human voice is the instrument. The rhythm is provided by feet, by the collective percussion of 200 pairs of shoes, finding the same beat on the same floor at the same moment. As more people join, the circle grows too large to maintain a single loop, and it begins to fold back on itself, spiraling inward, creating a double spiral, a triple spiral, until the dance fills the entire space and participants are weaving through corridors of their own making, passing people they entered with, orbiting a shared center. The effect at scale is extraordinary. 200 people performing the chain dance together creates something that transcends any individual participant. The sound is enormous and deeply human, polyphonic, overlapping, ancient. The movement is hypnotic. The experience, by most accounts, produces a feeling of collective belonging that is difficult to articulate but impossible to forget. The cuisine ballads that accompany the dance are a literary tradition in their own right. They are oral poetry of considerable sophistication, with complex meters and rhyme schemes, drawing on a body of story that goes back to the Norse literary tradition of the sagas. Learning them is a serious undertaking. A skilled skipari might know hundreds of verses by heart, sufficient to sustain a dance that lasts for hours. The role carries considerable prestige and responsibility within Faroese culture. The chain dance is not merely a tourist attraction. It is a genuine living tradition, practiced at private parties, at local festivals, at the great national celebration of Olavsoka, and in informal gatherings throughout the year. Children learn it. The elderly participate. It is one of those rare cultural practices that has not been relegated to performance or preservation. It simply persists as a part of ordinary life, as natural as singing around a table or gathering for a meal. In a world where folk traditions are increasingly confined to museums and heritage festivals, the Faroese chain dance remains stubbornly alive, unrecorded for most of its history, unkillable, as persistent as the wind that shaped the landscape where it was born. The Faroe Islands are not a destination you visit for a single site. They are a destination you visit for what's around every corner, and then the corner after that and the one after that. The landscape is so relentlessly surprising that after a while, you begin to feel almost ungrateful for how much beauty it throws at you. Start with the waterfall at Gassadalur, Mullafossor. It is perhaps the single most photographed site in the Faroe Islands. A stream from the mountains above the tiny village of Gassadalur reaches the cliff edge and drops, straight down in a white curtain, hundreds of feet to the Atlantic Ocean. Behind the waterfall, the village sits in impossible peace. A handful of turf-roofed houses, a few dozen inhabitants, a single road. Completed only in 2004, via a tunnel through the mountain that the village previously had no road access to whatsoever. The scale of the image is almost hallucinogenic. water falling from land into ocean, a village that looks like something from before the Industrial Revolution. Sky, sea, cliff, and grass. But Mulafossa is just one waterfall. The Faroe Islands have more waterfalls than they have settlements. In many places, every deep valley terminates in a cascade, water pouring off the edge of the island into the sea below. After a while, waterfalls begin to seem like punctuation in the landscape. Dramatic and beautiful, yes, but expected. This is a strange and wonderful thing to realize, that in the Faroe Islands, waterfalls are so common that they stop being astonishing. From Gassadalur, the journey leads to Survagsvatn, also known as Leidisvatn, the largest freshwater lake in the Faroe Islands. This lake contains one of the most disorienting optical illusions in the natural world. From a specific angle on the cliffs above, the lake appears to float. Not metaphorically float, literally float, suspended in midair above the Atlantic Ocean, perhaps 100 feet above the waves. The visual effect is perfect. The geometry of the cliff and the lake and the sea align so precisely that the brain simply cannot reconcile what the eyes are seeing. The lake is on the ground. It is lower than the cliff you're standing on, but it appears to be hovering in space. Photographs of this phenomenon have been shared millions of times online, and many people who see them assume they've been doctored. They haven't. It is simply a trick of perspective so well constructed by accident and geography that it seems impossible. Stand there and look at it, and you will genuinely not believe your eyes, even as you know, intellectually, exactly what you're looking at. Moving on, the rock formation known as Drangana presents another kind of wonder. Two sea stacks rise from the water between the island of Vagar and the uninhabited island of Dindholmur, connected by a natural arch of stone carved over centuries by the Atlantic. The larger of the two stacks is tall enough that people have been known to climb it, a technical and terrifying undertaking by all accounts. But even from a distance, from a boat moving through the water around it, Drangana is something else. A door in the sea, a stone gate standing between islands, the kind of geological feature that feels like it was designed rather than formed. Tindholmur itself is worth stopping for, a small uninhabited island shaped like a fist with 5 distinct cliff peaks, rising from the water in a formation that seems simultaneously intentional and impossible. It is not accessible by road. Getting there requires a boat. And that journey through the narrow sound between Vagar and Tindholmur, with the walls of the cliff rising on either side and seabirds wheeling overhead, is an experience that reduces most visitors to silence. Then there is Vestmanna, a sea canyon on the island of Strimoy, where organised boat trips take visitors deep into clefts in the cliffs, into darkness and echo, past walls of rock that rise hundreds of feet above the waterline, dripping with moss and occupied by thousands of nesting seabirds. The boats are small. The walls are enormous. The sound of waves in enclosed rock is something you feel as much as hear. It is one of those rare natural experiences that recalibrates your sense of scale. A reminder of just how old the rock is, how long the water has been working on it, and how briefly any human has been present for any of this. And Litla Dimun, the smallest of the main islands, uninhabited, rising from the sea with a cloud perpetually resting on its summit like a soft cap, is visible from multiple vantage points across the southern islands. From a distance, it seems to float too, the base obscured by sea mist, the summit wrapped in cloud, the whole island appearing to drift rather than anchor. It is one of the strangest looking pieces of land in the Atlantic, and it is unreachable except by the most determined travellers with private boats and calm weather. A reminder that not everything here is accessible, that some things remain untamed and apart. The beauty of extreme remoteness comes with an equally extreme price tag. The Faroe Islands sit hundreds of miles from the nearest significant population centres. There is no road connecting them to the European mainland. There is no railway, no bridge, no terrestrial link of any kind. Everything that comes to the islands, every avocado, every smartphone, every sofa, every car, every bottle of wine, arrives by ship or by plane. And the cost of that transport is paid, ultimately, by whoever buys the product. In a city like Hamburg or Lyon, a container ship arriving at the port brings goods for millions of people. The shipping cost is distributed across millions of transactions. The per unit cost is vanishingly small. In the Faroe Islands, the same container ship, or more accurately, a much smaller ship making a longer journey, brings goods for roughly 50,000 people. The economics are brutal. The shipping cost per transaction is many times higher, and there is no population density to absorb it. The result is prices that shock visitors arriving from mainland Europe or North America. A watermelon can cost $15 to $22. A simple restaurant meal typically starts at $25 to $35 and can go much higher at quality establishments. A cup of coffee in a cafe in Tórshavn will cost you more than the same coffee in Copenhagen, which is itself not a cheap city. Imported electronics, furniture, household goods, fresh fruit, and many packaged foods are significantly more expensive than in comparable European markets. This is not a case of profiteering or inefficiency. It is simply the mathematics of isolation. The Faroe Islands pay for every mile of Atlantic Ocean between themselves and their suppliers. Accommodation adds another layer of challenge. The islands have a limited number of hotel rooms, somewhere in the range of 1,000 to 1,500 at any given time. This is extraordinarily few for a destination that has become genuinely popular with international travelers in recent years. The Faroe Islands' dramatic landscapes have made them a magnet for photographers, hikers, and nature travelers, and the demand for accommodation has outpaced the supply significantly. In peak season, roughly June through August, rooms book out months in advance and prices climb sharply. Visitors who plan to travel without booking accommodation well ahead may find themselves priced out of anything comfortable, or, in some periods, struggling to find anything at all. The lesson is simple. The Faroe Islands reward those who plan. Not obsessive, anxious planning, but thoughtful, early planning. Book your accommodation early. Research the weather for your intended season. Pack layers, many layers. And accept going in that this trip will cost more than a comparable trip to an established European destination. The question is whether the experience is worth the premium. Most countries celebrate their national day with fireworks and speeches. Politicians wave flags, military parades proceed down wide boulevards, and by evening, everyone has dispersed back to ordinary life. The Faroe Islands do something different, something that is harder to stage manage and more genuinely felt. Every year, on the 28th and 29th of July, the Faroe Islands observe Ólavsøka, the country's most important cultural celebration. For 2 days, virtually the entire nation stops what it's doing and converges on the capital, Tórshavn. The word Ólavsøka means Olaf's Vigil, a reference to Saint Olaf, the Norwegian Viking king who died at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030 and was subsequently canonized. The feast of Saint Olaf has been observed in the Faroe Islands since the early Christian period, and over 1,000 years it has evolved from a religious commemoration into the defining expression of Faroese national identity. What happens during these 2 days is unlike any national celebration elsewhere in Europe. The first thing you notice is the clothing. Across Tórshavn, and indeed across the entire archipelago in the days leading up to the celebration, the traditional Faroese national costume appears. This is not the sad, self-conscious performance of heritage that characterizes many countries' folk dress revivals. In the Faroe Islands, the national costume is worn with genuine pride and considerable elegance. Intricately crafted garments in deep blues, blacks and reds, ornamented with handcrafted silver brooches, clasps and buttons. Men and women and children all dress up. Grandparents in full traditional dress walk with grandchildren in miniature versions of the same costume, the youngest often wearing the famous small black and red striped cap that has become an icon of Faroese identity. The centerpiece sporting event of Ólavsøka is the boat race. Long wooden rowing boats crewed by 5, 6, 8 or 10 oarsmen race in the harbour at Tórshavn. These boats have been training in waters around the islands for months. And the championship final at Ólavsøka is one of the most watched and celebrated sporting events in Faroese life. To win the Ólavsøka boat race is a genuine honour, the kind of honour that follows a rower for the rest of their life, that is mentioned in eulogies, that is remembered by the community for generations. Throughout the 2 days, the festival fills Tórshavn with concerts, folk music performances, art exhibitions, outdoor markets, football matches, and, inevitably, the chain dance. Crowds fill the streets and harbour area. Restaurants and bars overflow. The city that is ordinarily calm and quiet becomes the living center of the nation. And then, on the second day, something happens that is unique in the world. The Faroese parliament, the Løgting, one of the oldest functioning parliaments in the world, with roots going back to the Viking Age thing that first met on the Tingans Peninsula in Tórshavn over 1,000 years ago, formally opens its new session. Clergy, members of parliament, government officials, and civic leaders process through the streets in formal order, moving first to a church service and then to the parliament building for the opening ceremony. This combination, national cultural celebration, championship sporting event, traditional dance, folk music, and the formal opening of the national legislature, all occurring simultaneously over 2 days in a capital city that during this period holds something close to the entire population of the country, is genuinely unprecedented in the world. There is no other national holiday quite like Ólavsøka. It works because the Faroe Islands are small enough for it to work. When you have 50,000 people and a capital of around 20,000, the line between public event and community gathering is thin. Ólavsøka feels less like a festival that the nation attends and more like a gathering that the nation becomes. The distinction sounds subtle, but in practice, it is everything. There is no audience at Ólavsøka. Everyone is a participant. After all of this, the sheep on the roads and the rooftops, the women who left and the women who stayed, the tunnels under the ocean, the grass-roofed villages, the fermented lamb, the chain dance, the waterfalls that fall into the sea, the optical illusions, and the stone arches and the uninhabited islands wreathed in cloud, the prices that make your eyes water, and the national holiday that stops the whole country. What is the Faroe Islands really? It is a place that insists on itself. Many small places in the world have been flattened by the pressure of globalization, their distinctiveness smoothed away, their traditions preserved only in museums, their young people evacuated to cities that offer what no small place can provide. The Faroe Islands have resisted this, not entirely, not without cost, and not without losing things that matter. But the resistance is real. The Faroese language is spoken by virtually everyone, used in government, in media, in schools, in daily life. The traditional foods persist, not as novelty but as nourishment. The chain dance continues without instruments because it was never about the instruments. The turf roofs are still being built, not because the Faroe Islands can't afford other roofing materials, but because the turf roof is right, and the people know it. This is a place where a roundabout under the Atlantic Ocean has an original sculpture at its centre, where a national holiday includes a parliamentary opening, where the weather changes 5 times before noon and people shrug because that's just Tuesday, where 70,000 sheep have established a kind of informal veto over the road system, where young women leave because they have ambition, and some of them come back because the ambition and the place can eventually coexist. The Faroe Islands are not trying to be Iceland, which has become one of the world's most visited tourist destinations. They are not trying to be Norway, with its oil wealth and its outsized international profile. They are not trying to be Denmark, from which they are technically but not spiritually administered. They are trying to be themselves, which is harder, richer, stranger, and more interesting than any of the alternatives. You could, in theory, put the entire population of the Faroe Islands inside a medium-sized sports stadium. You could, in theory, drive across the widest point of the archipelago in an hour. You could, in theory, dismiss the Faroe Islands as too small, too remote, too cold, too expensive, too obscure. But you would be wrong. And you would be missing something that most of the world has never had the chance to see.